Okay, thank you. So for our panel today, we are going to be talking about paying for college. So that includes planning, saving, financial aid, and merit scholarships. And so our two panelists are going to be Susan Hillman from Earlham and Tim Height. Am I saying that right?
Haight.
Haight, sorry, from
No,
Swarthmore.
no,
So thank you both for being with us here today. So Katie, if you want to go ahead and start with the questions.
So I also want to take a quick second to invite our participants to introduce themselves in the chat, although I think we've already had both Gisela and Matt introduce themselves, so we can go ahead and keep going. We'll start off with each of the panelists introducing themselves. They'll talk a little bit about their personal relationship to our panel topic, and then we can shift to do a Q&A. And so we do have some prepped ahead of time FAQs that we can ask the panelists, but also both of y'all here can feel free to leave anything in the chat, and Avery and I can read them out and direct them to our panelists so that they can answer your questions. So I'd like to go ahead and invite Susan Hillman, the Director of International and Transfer Admissions at Earlham, to start us off. Susan?
Great, thanks so much. I'm Susan Hillman de Castañeda. I'm Director of International Admissions and Alumni Recruitment. I also work with transfer students and our Quaker students. So I have worked in admissions for 22 years at Earlham, but I work very closely with the financial aid director, especially concerning international students. But I also have a domestic territory, including Pennsylvania. So I do get a chance to talk with her a lot. And I also sit on the the committee of directors with the VP. So we talk a lot about financial aid strategy and what kinds of things we're working on so that hopefully more students are able to afford college. So while I don't put the actual financial aid packages together, I do work very closely with the financial aid director.
Awesome, thank you, Susan. And now I also want to invite Tim to introduce himself. He's the Assistant Director of Financial Aid at Swarthmore. So if you want to go ahead and just share a brief intro with us, Tim.
Hi, thanks for having me. So my name's Tim Haight, Assistant Director of Financial Aid at Swarthmore. This is my fourth year in financial aid. I started out at the Community College of Allegheny County in Pittsburgh and then moved to Swarthmore in January of 2020. So I have expertise, familiarity with federal financial aid, and at Swarthmore, we are a school that's that meets full 100% of determined need using a combination of our institutional scholarship and any federal financial aid that a student may qualify for. So I'm involved in reviewing, financial aid applications for institutional aid and federal financial aid. So I'm glad to be here, and I hope I can answer questions. My area of expertise is in need-based financial aid. I can have some familiarity with merit scholarships, but my area of expertise is with FAFSA and then need-based. So Swarthmore, for instance, we use the CSS profile in terms of institutional need-based aid, so I can answer any questions about that. Thank you.
Awesome, thank you. For those just joining us, if you want to go ahead, you can type a little intro for yourself in the chat. We're going to move on to questions right now. So I'll open it up to questions from our audience who's here right now with us. If you have any questions, you can leave them in the chat, and me and Avery will read them to our panelists. I'll leave maybe a minute or two if any of y'all have questions that you'd like to ask, and if there's not any burning questions from our participants here, I can go ahead and move on to our FAQ list and direct those to our panelists. Alrighty, start off with sort of a general question. Susan, if it's all right, if I direct this one to you first, and then Tim, you can also answer. So how much is tuition at your school? So for Susan, that would be Earlham. And then how much is tuition after aid on average for most students?
Okay, so tuition at Earlham is right around 46,000 US dollars. But if you add in all the costs, so tuition fees, room and board, health insurance, estimated amount for personal expenses and books, that brings it up to about 66,000 US dollars this year. So that's a great point, just pointing out that you need that as you're looking at the cost of attendance, it includes all of those other in addition to tuition. So it's important to keep that in mind as you're asking your questions so that you get the total cost that you need to be considering. So at Earlham, actually 100% of our students get some type of aid, whether that's merit aid. Well, everyone gets a merit scholarship. And then they're considered for need-based grant and then federal funding, or for international students, merit scholarship, need-based grant, and work award. And so again, the terminology is something that it's worthwhile studying a little bit so that your questions can get at the answer that you really need to have. And so, yeah, that's what I'll say for right now.
Is it fine if I drop a link in the chat to a resource that I think would be helpful? So one resource that I really like to direct families to is directly from the Department of Education. It's called the College Scorecard. And you can go on the College Scorecard, you can type in any institution of choice. And you can see statistics like what the average annual cost is after factoring in financial aid that, the average student will receive. You can see median debt on graduation, median earnings for specific programs. So I really recommend schools that you're looking at see what the data looks like for those schools when making decisions.
That's great, thank you. So we have a question in the chat. So Matt is asking about how things like 401ks and real estate factor into calculating financial aid. So Susan, do you want to try to answer that one first?
If I could just let Tim answer that.
Yeah, I think, yes, perfect. I'd like to answer this one. So on the FAFSA, any sort of funds that are in retirement accounts are specifically ignored. So those aren't factored in terms of review for need-based financial aid. Now, schools that use the CSS profile, the CSS profile does ask questions about what families have in retirement. Now, schools that I know of don't typically use funds that are in, say, in a 401k in terms of reviewing eligibility for need-based scholarship. I can tell you, for instance, that Swarthmore does not. I don't know if there are schools that do, but the profile does ask the question, and to the extent that we use it, we and other schools that don't use it in their initial calculation of a family's determined need. They might use it if a family submits an appeal, for instance, to get a better sense of what the family's financial situation is. Now in terms of other real estate that and I'm going to say separate from the primary home in terms of the FAFSA, that is considered both on the FAFSA and for institutional scholarship. FAFSA does not consider equity in the primary home, but most schools that use, say, the CSS profile may for their institutional application will consider home equity in determining need-based financial aid in terms of what schools may expect as a contribution from, say, assets. We look at and the FAFSA look at assess family based on income and assets that they have. Now some schools, in terms of home equity, for instance, I can't say exactly how, but Swarthmore typically would not assess the full home equity. Some schools may assess the full home equity. I can say it's usually some schools may base it, say, on family income, but that's the most I can say on that. But I hope that's helpful in answering your question.
I can just say from Earlham's perspective, I talked to the financial aid director before I came, and she said at Earlham, we don't consider the value of the family home or retirement assets or business or family farm if it employs fewer than 100 people. So those things are not included in our assessment of expected family contribution.
That's a good point, and I'll add on that from Swarthmore's perspective in similar schools to us. As Susan said, the FAFSA specifically excludes small family owned businesses, which is essentially the definition that she gave. Swarthmore and probably schools that use the CSS profile do consider the net worth of all businesses that a family would be involved in. So in terms of our institutionally, we would consider that, but some schools may not, and the FAFSA only does not specifically excludes small family owned businesses.
Awesome, thank you both. We have a question about FAFSA, so this might be a little bit more in Tim's wheelhouse, but if either of y'all feels like you have a good answer for this, please feel free to share. So this question is, if in 2021, one of your parents was receiving pandemic unemployment and you reported this income on your FAFSA, and now they are unemployed but not receiving unemployment, how should you communicate that with the school, and if so, when and how?
It's always worth, and I presume this was obviously reported on the tax return. And as you probably know, in 2020, there was a specific portion of unemployment that could be excluded from the tax return. And you do want to be sure that you don't report that, as untaxed income on the FAFSA. Now some schools, like Swarthmore, that take a more, comprehensive review of, income and asset information in terms of institutional aid may look at that differently than, say, the FAFSA does. But if there's a change in income, it's always worth going to your school's financial aid office, letting them know that you are no longer receiving this source of income. And most schools are going to have some sort of reconsideration process that you can go through, and you can provide more detail about your family's change in income situation. And it's always worth doing that. I'd say do that as soon as possible, so you can establish a relationship with your school's financial aid office early, and they can guide you on how to go through that process.
Yeah, just to that's certainly true at Earlham. We use the FAFSA, so free application for federal student aid report information as we're putting together the financial aid package. So if there's any change, so now when you fill out the FAFSA, you use prior taxes. Mm-hmm. So if you just remember so let's say you're starting school in 2023, so you would use taxes from 2021. So students who are starting school this fall have actually used the 2020 tax information on their FAFSA. So a lot can happen in those years. So if you lose a job or gain a job, you really should report those changes to your institution, especially if your income's less, which then would probably make you eligible for more aid, even if it's just from the institutional point of view.
So we have another couple of questions from the chat. So the first one is, the FAFSA is no longer splitting EFC among students that are in college. It's changing from calling it EFC to student index. So if they have 2 students in college beginning in 2023, will the schools still take into consideration older siblings' college tuitions, or no longer is that happening?
Well, I'll answer this from Swarthmore's perspective, and obviously, I can tell you that we're obviously thinking about the changes that are coming to the FAFSA. We also use the CSS profile, and the CSS profile does ask about number of siblings that are going to be enrolled into college at the same time as the student will be, and we do take that into consideration when reviewing a student's financial situation. In terms of how schools may address that in the future, I can't say exactly for sure. Now, I believe the FAFSA will still be collecting that information. It won't be used in the contribution, but they'll still be able to provide that information to the schools. And it would likely be a school. It never hurts to, when that time comes, to ask the school how they may consider that information, because school may choose. They may not have to, but they can collect information based on your circumstances, and they may be able to, as a part, again, as I mentioned, most schools will have a reconsideration process. May be able to take that into consideration and potentially, revise a financial aid decision that has been received.
Yeah, I would echo what Tim's saying. We've started that discussion about how are we going to respond to that change in the FAFSA. So there's the information we get from the federal government, but then every institution has its own institutional policy. So that's where, as Tim was mentioning, it's always helpful. You can always ask a question and explain your circumstances. And there's usually an appeal process at every institution where you can, you might get your initial financial aid package and you can write back an appeal asking, giving additional information, asking more questions. So it usually is a very fluid process. The initial financial aid package is the beginning of that, just so you know. And then as you're letting us know, oh, there are actually 3 students in college this year, et cetera, and by institution, they can decide their response to that.
Awesome, thank you both.
Oh,
go ahead.
I didn't mean to interrupt, but I did. I had a question sent to me, and I was wondering if it's okay if I could answer that, or I didn't want to interrupt you. My apologies.
No, go ahead. Yeah, you're good.
I did have a specific question about sibling income, and if I'm misunderstanding the question, to the person who asked it, please let me know. But the FAFSA, in terms of, say, a dependent student, only looks at the parent's income, and any household income from somebody that would be included in the household will not be considered. The only exception would be a circumstance, say, where you were an independent. Well, actually, there really would be no circumstance where that would be. If you were, say, an independent student and you received, income from your brother in the year under consideration, then that may be assessed. But on the base application, your parents would be the primary source of the income, and your brother's income wouldn't be considered. And even institutionally, we wouldn't consider that. And I don't know of any schools that would consider that. But so the answer is no, that wouldn't be. Siblings' income wouldn't be considered.
Awesome. Thank you, Tim. We have another question from the chat, and this can be directed to either of you who feels like you've got an answer. Is it better from a financial aid perspective to own an investment property in an LLC or a trust versus in a personal name?
I'll let you.
I can answer this, and I just want to preface this very strongly. We're not financial planners in the financial aid office, so we can only speak to the facts in terms of how they would be reported on the application, and without more specific details, I can only give a general answer. But any sort of personal investment, that's not formally owned by a business. So say, like, if there's a debt that's officially secured by a business and it's separate from your personal assets, would be considered, a personal investment. We reported as, such on the application. If say you have an investment that's part of an LLC and it's officially disassociated from you and it's an actual business entity, then that would be treated like a business and it would be subject on the FAFSA. Now, this is, like I said, general answer. There could be more specific, complicated parts to a business that might change this, but generally, it would fall according to the business rules on the FAFSA. But for schools, say like Swarthmore, that use the CSS profile, we are going to ask for that information regardless. Now, businesses are treated slightly more favorably than personal assets because, we understand that, business, you don't have essentially full, reins of the business, and a business isn't as liquid as, say, like, stocks, savings. So there's consideration there in terms of how the business is treated. But generally, personal investments are going to be, treated as an investment and only would be considered a business if they're formally part of a business. Typically, the entity would file a business tax return and would offer substantial like services of, say, an investment property like cleaning and such. But hope that answers the question somewhat and gives you some help. But again, we're not financial planners. We can't give specific information.
Thank you. We have another question in the chat. So when financial aid is determined at the time of admission, such as like merit scholarships or grants, do those apply to all 4 years of college? Do they change over time? What are the deciding factors? Anything like that. So I'll open that up to either of you, whichever one of you wants to answer first.
Well, I won't speak to merit age simply because Swarthmore only our financial aid office is really only providing need-based financially. Now, each year we assess the application, so you'd have to fill out, and the FAFSA you have to fill out every year for consideration for federal aid, but also at Swarthmore for institutional aid, you would have to fill out the application each 4 years. So no, it's not set at the time of admission. Now, I did say I wasn't going to speak on merit aid, but I'll say a little bit. Merit aid could be considered for all 4 years, but there's generally going to be specific requirements that you have to meet each year. So like if it's an academic scholarship, you'll have to have a certain GPA in order to have the scholarship renewed. And those amounts could be consistent from year to year, but in terms of merit, Susan may be a bit more able to answer than me on that end, but hopefully I didn't say anything incorrect.
That's a great distinction because merit aid typically is set by the admissions office when you're admitting a student because it's based on, at Earlham anyway, your grades and your test scores. So that's the merit, like you've earned this award because of your academic achievement in high school. At Earlham, as we read your application, the admissions counselor, well, actually the computer figures it out for us, how much merit aid you will receive, and we can either agree or disagree with that and state why. So if, for example, a school doesn't weight their grades, but every other school does, and the student's done really well, and if we weighted it, then it would move them up a level of merit scholarship, we'll probably do that. So it benefits the student. So our merit aid is the same for all 4 years. So let's say you get a $32,000 merit aid, merit scholarship. So the difference between aid and scholarship is kind of important. So it's a scholarship and you've earned it. Then at Earlham, you get it every year for 4 years, as long as you maintain that grade point average needed to keep that. We've set that at a level where most students are able to keep their merit scholarship because we want them to keep it. And but the need-based grant, so if we give you additional funding to help you make it possible to come, that could change every year depending on your family income, what the report is, what your expected family contribution is for that particular year. So the need-based grant could change. depending on your family situation that year. And then another form of aid would be a work award that is subsidized by the federal government, and it allows students to work a certain number of hours on campus in a job. Most students use that money to pay for books and personal expenses, although it's up to you and your family how you're going to use that work award. And so it's up to the student to get the job, work the job before they get the money. And usually, again, if you've gotten it in your first year, unless there's a big change in your family income, you would be eligible for that work award every year. So it is important to remember that, like, your financial aid package for this year might look very different than next year, depending on income of your family and other financial considerations. Merit scholarships typically are awarded for 4 years as long as you meet the grade point average. So hopefully that answers that question.
Yeah, thank you both. If there's no other questions from the chat, we can just jump back to the FAQ list. No, we do have one.
Well, I actually also had one sent to me again, and I can put another link in the chat. Most schools that I know of, not all, but most will generally offer some sort of need-based institutionally. Now, I did work at a school where we basically only had federal financial aid, and then only funds set aside for work beyond the federal work study, which Susan had mentioned in terms of work federally, subsidized from the government. That's from the federal work study program. There are schools, and generally these are going to be schools that use the CSS profile, and I'm going to put those in the chat. There are schools out there that meet, full, determined need. And again, there are some that do it, without loan, Swarthmore being an example of that. I'm going to put in the chat a list of participating schools that use the CSS profile. And this is directly from the College Board, the site that uses the CSS profile. This isn't a list of all schools that consider, that have need-based aid, but generally a rule of thumb, not always, but the big rule of thumb is a school that uses the CSS profile generally, will have some sort of fairly robust, need-based aid program. Not all schools, but generally most schools. And you can see there are some, you can filter by schools that look at non-custodial parent information, schools that, international students, et cetera. So hopefully that'll be helpful for that question.
Yeah, thank you. We've got another question from the chat asking if a student's parents are divorced and one parent has 100% custody and is remarried, how do they decide the estimated family contribution, and is that based only on the parent with custody?
So I'll take this question, and well, I'll tell you this. There are specific rules on the FAFSA as to which parent would be reporting. The FAFSA only looks at the custodial parent. In terms of the FAFSA, now this is caveat pre changes that are coming to the FAFSA. Generally, it's the parent that the student has lived with for the most 12 most recent months prior to filling out the application. There are some complicated cases where students spend equal time with both parents. And in that case, it's generally the parent who provided the most support to the student. And that's generally going to be based on who has the most income. And if those tests sort of fail, then I would speak to the financial aid office directly, because that suggests that there's a much more complicated situation at play that would be best to address the financial aid office with. In terms of institutional aid, schools like ours, again, I'll speak from Swarthmore's point of view. We do expect a contribution from both biological parents. Some schools, in terms of whether the parents have remarried, generally are going to be different. But I can tell you at Swarthmore, we're primarily focused on the biological parents. So that's the main parent parents of interest were factoring in beyond, say, like jointly, shared assets, between the family. But generally, we're concerned with, both biological parents. That's the primary parents of consideration in the contribution.
Thank you. I have a question sent to me from the chat asking, will my parents fill out one FAFSA form for me and a separate one for my siblings, or is it the same form?
They will complete separate applications for each sibling.
And just to go along with that, so the parent has to have a federal student application ID number, and each student has to have one as well. You have separate ID numbers. You have to sign, you actually have to sign the form. We get a number of forms in every year that can't be processed because either the student didn't sign it or the parent didn't sign it. So make sure you follow the steps all the way through to the very end, like successful completion of your FAFSA.
Yes.
And you also have to have a PIN number, which you have to get separately before you actually start the whole process.
Well, it's highly recommended, yes, that you create an FSA ID, the parent and the student. If you don't create an FSA ID, there's things you can't do, like the parents can't, you can't use the IRS data retrieval tool to bring in tax information. You can't sign electronically, and you otherwise have to send you can either give a physical copy of the form to your school's financial aid office, or you have to send it to a processing center, which takes a number of weeks. And I've encountered many delays where the processing center, and you have to worry about things getting lost in the mail. Please create a FSA ID. Very highly recommended, so you don't run into those issues, and you have full access to all the federal student aid website opportunities. And also, so you have access to, say, like the National Student Loan Database after you graduate, so you can view the status of it. It's just very, very recommended to have the FSA ID.
Thank you. So we're going to go ahead and pull from our FAQs. So what kind of financial aid opportunities are offered for specifically Quaker students at your school? And how would that be different from typical financial aid and scholarships? So I'm going to ask Susan to go ahead and answer that one first.
Sure, great, thank you. We do have a Quaker Fellows program at Earlham, which is somewhat similar to the Quaker Leadership program at Guilford. There is an extra scholarship for the Quaker Fellows. There's an application process that goes through our Quaker Fellows office. So it's separate from the application to the college, and students are awarded a $2,500 scholarship. In addition to that, they're also given preferential consideration, or there's certain words, preferential financial aid packaging to help reduce loans and any gaps that might be present. So that's something I think we've been doing it maybe almost 8 years now. And it's a wonderful program if you're wanting to continue your Quaker leadership development and be with a cohort of students who are very interested in talking about Quakerism. But we do have students also from Unitarian Universalists, Mennonites, Brethren in our Quaker Fellows program. So that's one specifically for our Quaker students.
So, Swarthmore primarily offers, need-based aid. Now, we do have certain named scholarships. Now, these don't impact the actual, need-based calculation, but there are, a variety of endowed funding sources where the scholarships come from. And, some do have Quaker Unitarian Universalist designations. So again, they don't actually impact the amount that's provided. Our decisions are based primarily on, you know, just the income and asset information provided on the applications. Now, there may be external scholarships. Say one source that I'll point to is College Board's Big Future search has a wide repository of scholarships, and Eric, you could probably find external scholarships from Quaker organizations that award scholarship funds to those affiliated with the Quaker religion.
Awesome, thank you both. I have another question from the chat, just asking for y'all to generally talk about Pell Aid and how that works at your school. I guess I'll just direct that to Susan first, if you have an answer for that.
Well, Pell Grants are determined again by the information provided on your financial aid application through the FAFSA, and Earlham does have a very high number percentage of students who are Pell eligible. We do want to offer students who might think it's impossible to attend a school still that opportunity to have a Pell grant, again, which is something you do not have to pay back, and it's something that we have worked hard on to increase our number of Pell eligible students.
And to add on that, and I may be misunderstanding the question, so whoever asked it, please correct me if I'm wrong. The federal Pell Grant's determined by the federal government's methodology, so schools don't have flexibility. They don't really determine the students who have a Pell Grant day. It's all based on the FAFSA and the federal government. Now, there is a supplemental, something called SEOG. Now that's still obviously determined by information on the FAFSA, but the schools may have their own awarding criteria. So there are some funds that are provided. They are based, federal funds based on the FAFSA, but they're provided to schools directly, and schools can choose how to award those funds to students. Now, there are criteria that schools have to follow, and one of those is obviously prioritizing, for SEOG, prioritizing federal Pell Grant students. But beyond that, I mean, there's no flexibility by the school in determining who receives a federal Pell Grant. That's all determined by the federal methodology.
Okay, thank you. So let's go ahead and ask, I think we have time for at least one more question. So what kind of debt relief programs are offered at your specific schools?
I can talk, but Swarthmore is a bit unique because, as I said earlier, we meet full demonstrated need without the use of loans. Now, again, students can borrow if they choose, but we, generally to other schools, because of our, robust need-based aid program, we don't generally have as many students borrowing. Now, one organization I can talk about, and this isn't affiliated through Swarthmore, but we partner with them. There is something called the Mellon Mays Undergraduate Fellowship, and that program, certain graduates, and you can go to their website for specifics. Again, this isn't something offered through Swarthmore, but that program does offer debt relief if a student borrowed federal loans at Swarthmore if they qualify. But again, we're not, our programs are slightly a bit different simply because of how our institution meets full need without loans. I don't know if Susan has anything to add based on Earlham.
Yeah, so we don't have particular program to help students get out of debt. We do have counseling ahead of time to help them find other ways to meet their obligations to pay for their college education. So our director of financial aid will call most families who have like a high need and talk with them about options for looking for other ways to help pay for their education. So we try to do the education on the front end of your college experience. Yeah, that's what I can say about that.
And that's a good point from Susan, to the extent that when I speak with students, always stress finding other alternatives that don't, aid that doesn't have to be repaid before turning to loans. So we package all students that apply for, institutional aid with that, put in their financial aid decisions, a campus work opportunity. So that's one, option we'll talk with students to, and then outside scholarships as well, to the extent that, Swarthmore is able to incorporate those into a financial aid decision before reducing our need-based grant. Again, as Susan said, to the extent that we can in the front end for, students that may come to our office, we always try to point them first to, non-loan sources before counseling them on, a federal loan option.
I also want to point out, just along the lines of extra scholarships, and Tim's mentioned several times of looking for outside scholarships. So there is the, what was the one you mentioned, Tim?
The College Board Big Future Scholarship search.
Yeah, Big Futures, there's the FastWeb, there's Zinch.com, there's Petersons.com, scholarship.com, where you can go and look for scholarships. Now, it is kind of like a job that because there are so many of them. Our financial aid director encourages students to spend as much time. Some of them ask for an essay. So spend as much time on that essay as you do on your application essay, because this one could help you bring in more money. There are some of these that you fill out a whole lot of information, but then that engine will go and look for scholarships for you. So there are a lot of different ways to find outside scholarships. And at Earlham, if a student brings in an outside scholarship, we'll reduce your loans first. We reduce the less advantageous financial part on your financial aid application package first. And also, there are some schools have special scholarships. So I mentioned the Quaker Fellow Scholarship at Earlham. Some schools give out music scholarships, theater scholarships, art scholarships. If it's a Division I or Division II, there are athletic scholarships in addition to the other aid that you're already getting. So it's worthwhile to look at the website, the college website, and see what other scholarships might be available. Some of them are stackable, meaning you just keep getting to add on the amount of money. Some aren't, but some are. My daughter, for example, went to a small liberal arts school in Kentucky, and she came across a scholarship that she thought she had to apply for, but she didn't have to, but she did it because she thought she had to. And it ended up getting her an additional $23,000 a year scholarship, which made it possible for her to go to that school. It was wonderful. So that was a diversity scholarship, a multicultural scholarship. So check out the financial aid options for all the colleges you're considering and see what additional scholarships that particular college has available to students. Usually they do require an additional application, but it's totally worth it if you're going to be getting some extra funding.
And Susan brought up a good point, which I alluded to, but I want to go into a bit more detail. You should check with your school's financial aid office to see how they will treat outside scholarships that you bring into the institution. For instance, at Swarthmore, we have an expectation that students would earn about $2,000, incoming students, $2,000 from their summer earnings, and that's baked into the contribution, that our office delivers, in the financial aid decision. And then we also would allow an outside scholarship to reduce the work component in the financial aid decision. But anything above that, we would then reduce our need-based scholarship dollar for dollar. So that's similar to our peer institutions. So again, schools should have sort of like a handbook or something that goes into how they treat the outside scholarships. And if you're not able to find out on their website, you can email the financial aid office and they will make sure to, reiterate that process to you. But it's very important that you do check in with your school's financial aid office about that. So, you're not surprised by how the school treats, the outside scholarship that you receive.
One last thing, as you're looking at schools, what a consumer would call a sticker price clearly isn't what you're going to have to pay in most cases. And sometimes a school that looks like it costs less might actually give less financial aid. So it might be more feasible, more economical for you to go to a school that looks like it's going to cost more, but they give more aid. In our case, for example, our financial aid packages look very similar to a state university in Indiana because of state aid. So students, we always encourage them, like, don't write us off just because it looks expensive. Give us a chance to do your financial aid package for you.
Yes, that's absolutely correct. You may have heard the term sticker shock thrown around, and you would just want to be, you want to be sure that, you at least apply to the school and see what financial aid decision you receive. You don't want to write off a school simply just because of the cost. And one thing you can do, and each school is going to have this because it's mandated by the federal government, though each school that you go to may have some caveats on certain data that goes into this, but you can check out what's called the school's net price calculator. And what you can do in there's basically input your income, asset information. And some schools that award merit aid might have sort of a merit sort of component to their net price calculator that you do want to, they probably will have specific caveats there listed within net price calculators. Net price calculator isn't a binding offer. And, Swarthmore, we don't use that in, a family that uses the net price calculator. We don't take those results into consideration when, determining a financial aid decision. But it's helpful to at least go into and using the net price calculator, though, making sure that you read the caveats listed on the net price calculator, school's net price calculator website. And Swarthmore has a number of caveats when using the net price calculator, but it's at least one tool you can use to try and sort of at least have a preview of what the net price for the year might look like. And it is just based off of the academic year.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So thank you to our panelists and thank you to everyone who joined. We're going to have a very quick moment of silence since we're going over time a little bit. And then we will have our next panel very soon. So we're going to have a quick moment of silence. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, everyone. As I wrote in the chat, we're going to be having a next panel will be here too. So if you want to stick around, you can do so. But yeah, huge thanks to our panelists and our moderators. Thank you, Tim and Susan and Katie and Avery. And thanks everyone for joining us. Keep an eye out for these recordings will be on the PYM website with the different materials that have been shared, and you can review any of the panels at your leisure.
Becca, if it's okay, I'd like to put my contact information in the chat. So if anybody has questions, they're welcome to follow up with me, especially if you have perhaps a more, detailed question that might be personally, sensitive to your own situation. I'm happy to provide my contact information. Anybody's welcome to follow up with me.
Thank you, Tim. That is so generous. I'm sure people will appreciate that.
Yeah. Yes, I'll put my, I'll put my, that's my email, and then my phone number is. Oh, I accidentally did not send that as a group chat, so let me do that again so it comes correctly.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Tim. And thank you, Susan. Great to have you.
It was nice.
Pleasure. Thank you for having me.